All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Heidi Siegelbaum from the Washington Stormwater Center, and I want to welcome you all to Crystal Borde from Vanguard Communications, who is going to talk about people first, how to create inclusive marketing efforts that engage overburdened communities. Crystal also joins us from Washington, D.C., so thank you, Crystal, for communicating with us from the other side of the country. Please put your questions in the chat box, and then Crystal will take them at the end. Thank you so much. Welcome, Crystal.
Thank you so much, Heidi, and hello, everybody. I'm so honored to be a part of this conference event and to talk about an issue that's very important to me and a center of my social marketing work, and hoping that there will be insights that are going to be really valuable for the work that you're doing throughout the state. So as Heidi mentioned, I'm going to be talking about people first and what that is, and how that relates to the marketing efforts that we're all conducting, particularly when we're trying to reach out to overburdened communities. So a little bit about me. So I'm a vice president at Vanguard Communications. We are a social marketing and PR firm based in Washington, D.C. All of our clients are nonprofit organizations, government agencies, foundations, and associations. So we are doing social change work all the time and working on social issues such as environmental justice, sustainable agriculture, mental health, and so many different other issues that are so critical in our society today. As part of my duties at Vanguard, I'm also the lead of our diversity, equity, inclusion practice. So my intention for this workshop today is I'm kind of blending those two expertise areas in my life, from social marketing as well as diversity, equity, inclusion, to really focus in on, one of the state goals of really looking at how can we best engage overburdened communities throughout the state on issues related to environmental justice and pollution, and those campaigns that you all are and initiatives you're implementing in those spaces. So to start off, I have an image on the screen that is actually a photograph that I took. It's a close-up of the famous Iwo Jima Memorial that's here in Arlington, Virginia. So if you remember, it's the flag raisers on Iwo Jima that's depicted here. And I love to start with this image when we talk about inclusion, because I think it's really important to focus in on how many hands or how many people or how many individuals, communities, partners are involved with making our efforts as effective and engaging and successful as possible. And so it's a team effort. And so how do we construct that team? And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So the things I'm going to be covering in this presentation is, one, I'm going to talk about what people first means in social marketing, right? And why it's important that we have that approach when creating these marketing campaigns. I also want to share some really effective inclusion strategies that we should be thinking about as social marketers and as marketers, and also make some suggestions about ways that you can collaborate with these communities in order to kind of create that people first environment. Full disclosure, I'm not an expert on environmental justice. I'm not an expert on the issues that you're dealing with in your agencies related to stormwater and related to things specific to the communities within your state. So that's the full disclosure. What I am an expert in is how to help organizations take key social marketing approaches and strategies and best reach, through a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens, the audiences they're trying to engage. So as I go through this presentation, keep in mind your own situation. Keep in mind your program. Keep in mind the communities that maybe have been challenging to reach in the past, or not as, past efforts have not been as successful. Keep that all in the back of your mind as we go through. When you have questions, please enter them so that in the question and answer period at the end, we can address some of those. All right, so first, what is people first and how is that a social marketing approach? And basically it's about centering the audience in the process. So what people first means to me is that we're putting the audience in the center of what we do. And we do it with the intention that we want more inclusion. We want to be respectful of them and their challenges and their situations and the influences that are influencing whether they can make changes or not. And we're also doing it because it's going to be more effective, what we create in the end. So like this picture, it's just kind of bringing more people to the table, proverbially. And it's really that we are making our work people-centered. I love to mention this advocacy movement slogan because it's a really central part of how I conduct social marketing, and I know a lot of colleagues in the space do. And this was initiated in the 1970s by a disabilities rights movement that were trying to advocate for having more of a voice in the decision-making process of how their disabilities were being addressed by systems, right, or structures or communities. And it's basically nothing about us without us. Right? So it's the acknowledgement that we can't make decisions without including the people who are being impacted by the decisions in the process. And that is really what People First is about creating the spaces and the time and the moments in our social marketing work for our audiences to be really a central part of the process. So for many of you who do this work all the time, I'm sure this wheel looks very familiar. This is kind of traditionally how we talk about the social marketing process, the goal being the most important starting point in this whole process. And for my presentation, that is still true. You need to have a very strong communications goal. It gives you direction for the rest of your work. However, you'll notice the second phase is audience, and that is by no mistake. And it's because once we figure out our goal tells us who our audiences should be, and then our audiences should be integrated into literally every aspect of the following phases, including the goal, because it is a cycle, so we're going to keep going round and round. And so that is kind of illustrates what I'm talking about here about how the audience should be really integrated into all aspects, messages, channels, what activities we do, the testing, the evaluation, all of these elements in order to kind of be more effective. This diagram may also seem familiar to you. I hope it is. It's, formally called the Continuum of Understanding and Acceptance. Often we all kind of call it the stages of change. And what it reflects is that our audiences fit somewhere in one of these boxes when we start our campaign work, from unawareness, where they have no knowledge or understanding of what it is that we are trying to create behavior change around, to the end goal, which is full support of whatever, meaning they made that change, they're encouraging other people to make that change, but we're trying to kind of move them along this process so that we can get to that full support zone. Typically, this is what we think should happen. We think that if we provide a lot of information and data and proof and evidence that these kind of changes are necessary, are important, will benefit them, that is how we can move people along this continuum. So we provide at all these different points, we provide information upon information after information. But what really happens? How effective is it really? This is what often happens, or really happens, is that, we meet our audience often in that unawareness or basic understanding phases. We give them information and then nothing happens, right? Those arrows between interests and desire to learn more and to full support often don't happen. It becomes a very frustrating process for a team because you're just not getting the outcomes. And it's frustrating because you're like, I'm giving them the information that they need. This will inform why they should make these choices or make these changes, and they're just not doing it. Why? And I think it's because we're not doing the right things at these different points. And that's getting us back to that people first mentality. We need to be asking the right questions. We need to be doing more listening to what they need. We need to build inroads and partnerships. We need to provide information that is responsive to what those answers were to the questions, what their needs were, what our new partners are informing us that they need, and then provide that information through trusted channels. And then to finally get that support, we need to give them some resources, right? Whether that's messaging or materials or activities or whatever it is that kind of aligns at that point to kind of get them to that final support mode. But you'll notice that each of these inputs are driven by our audience, who they are, what they need, and what impacts them. That is what a people-first social marketing approach really looks like in practice. So when we're asking these questions, we're asking them because we want to know more about our audience, right? This is how we get inside their head, inside their lives. And I emphasize the life part because I think that influences a lot of the choices that they make and lifestyle changes people are willing to do. So these are the basic questions we often ask, right? And audience research is a central part of social marketing, and a lot of us are already doing that. However, beyond these questions, which are important and we should ask them, when we're dealing with overburdened communities, we need to ask additional questions. And the reason we need to ask those additional questions is because they are dealing with additional influences, whether that's historic, cultural, personal, systemic, or structural, that are also influencing their choices and whether or not they're willing or open to behavior change. We need to ask them what their needs are. We need to know what motivates them. We need to know what they think their benefits to change are. So not just what we think they are, but what they think that they are, what those perceptions are. And then we have to know what are those barriers? What are the barriers that they feel, whether tangible or intangible, visible or invisible, that would be preventing them from taking the next step. So I'd like to bring up, this is the definition that the EPA has provided about how they define an overburdened community. And you'll see in the highlighted words, a lot of how we see overburdened communities indicate what some of those initial barriers are, right? That they are experiencing a disproportionate amount of environmental harms and risk. They have greater vulnerability to environmental hazards. They have lack of opportunity in public participation. So they oftentimes lack representation, right? That they sometimes have an accumulation of negative or lack of positive environmental, health, economic, or social conditions. So already we're even acknowledging at a government agency level some of the barriers that already exist. And that is kind of the big umbrella, but then we need to get into more specifics as to kind of specifically for the communities we're communicating with, what are those barriers? So some of the things that could be potential barriers that we have to keep in mind is, this is a really great chart that was designed by Udarta Consulting that does DEI consulting for organizations. And they were thinking of individual as the box in the middle and look at all the things that are impacting and shaping their identity. And their identity is often how they experience the world, how they see the world. So that is shaped by culture, by their individual experiences, particularly with trauma and history, right? They're also shaped by their family's experiences, the stories and history and the narrative for their identity community. And identity community could be race and ethnicity, it could be gender identity, it could be sexual identity, it could be a variety of different factors. So we're thinking about multiple levels of community identity here, as well as the institutional influences that are on it, right? What their school experiences were, if there was a school experience, what their work experiences are, or the challenges related to that. What are the services that are provided in their community or lack thereof? All of those things shape how these individuals within a community perceive and interact, as well as interact with the messaging and content that we're sharing with them. We also have these other barriers that are oftentimes out of our control, but are huge influencing factors, which is the systemic inequities, disparities, and injustices that exist throughout our communities. And so I love to show this graphic because I think it's an important way of illustrating kind of what we're working towards, as well as what we're working against, right? That we're moving from, I think everyone was thinking about equality, but that isn't really what helps people advance and helps improve their lives. Then we started talking about equity, and that's really important, where people are given access to opportunities. But even then, there's still barrier, right? And justice is kind of the end game, and that very much aligns with the work that you all are doing in environmental justice work in your state and in your communities, because justice is about removing the fence. It's about removing the barrier. So it doesn't matter where you're standing, you are not obstructed by systems and policies and procedures that limit your opportunity and growth and health and wellness at the end. So we kind of set the stage of what people first social marketing looks like. So how do we get the audience in the center of our work, right? And part of that is that we have to invite them in. And I like to think of it as a bit of a dance. And I like to use this analogy to kind of explain the steps as to how you can create what I call authentic audience inclusion. So the first thing is Verna Myers, who's a very well-known diversity inclusion consultant. She has said that diversity is receiving an invitation to a dance, equity is possessing the resources to attend, and inclusion is being asked to dance. And that is what I'm going to focus on next, is talking about how can we not only invite people to be a part of our process, but also include them in it as well, and get to that people first center. So I also want to put this up here to kind of, you're going to see some dance images. So I hope that's okay with you. I have a dance background, so this is a very natural communicating space for me. And I put two men dancing because that is an unexpected partnership. And I think that that's also something we have to keep in mind, that like, yes, we should always explore the kind of traditional opportunities in partnership and people to partner with. But then there can be huge benefits in thinking outside the box and looking at those kind of untraditional opportunities and seeing how we can leverage them further. So the first step in this process is awareness. It's the research step, right? It's you're standing on the wings and you're surveying the dance floor and you're just trying to figure out who's here, right? And who might make a good person to ask to dance. So how do you do this? So you need to assess the factors that influence identity. So a lot of the things that we talked about earlier, talking about what are the things that are impacting your audience that you're trying to reach, the systemic racism issues, cultural influences, etc. You need to also be conscious of your own implicit biases. And this is a big step. It's the one that is no one can do for you. You have to do for yourself to have that self-reflection, because we all have bias, regardless of what communities we identify with or what our past experiences are. All of us have bias, and they're constantly implicitly impacting the decisions that we're making and how we interpret the world around us. And so in order to really do this authentic audience inclusion work well, it's important to know your own implicit biases and see how those might be influencing your perception of these opportunities. And then you want to really deepen, once you figure that out, deepen your understanding of how that identity shapes you, as well as deepen your understanding of how those identities shape the audiences you're trying to reach. So basically, this awareness step is about leveling the playing field, using information, self-reflection to do that. The second step is engagement. This is where we actually make the invitation to our dance partners to join us in a dance. So you want to make an invitation, like a legitimate invitation, identifying an individual, reaching out to them, inviting them to be a part of what the work that you're doing. You want to do this invitation as early as you possibly can in the process, because as I mentioned, we want to include them in all aspects of our social marketing process. So that means that inviting them as early as we can into that work is going to be the most effective, and we're going to get the most out of it. And the invitation could be to an individual, it could be to a group of people. It just kind of depends on what it is that you're trying to accomplish and who it is you're trying to reach. Then you want to engage your audience members as counsel. right? You want to make it clear to them that you're looking, you want to hear their perspectives, you want to hear their vantage points, that you're here to listen, right? And that's a very important first element of building that relationship. And then to take it a step further, and this is a way of setting expectations for people, it's really great if there's formality that you can add to this. So creating real roles or leadership opportunities throughout the work. So whether that's in a program or initiative or a campaign, you know, what are ways of doing that? So whether that's like forming an advisory council or an ambassador program, or have like a leadership summit in which people can attend and serve as audience counselors, that's a term that I like to use, as a way to contribute to the process. And in a government environment, that can always be a little tricky. So it may take some creativity to kind of figure out what formal roles you could create and offer. But if there is possibility or wiggle room to do that, it's worth considering. The third step is about collaboration. So you've made the invitation and you've kind of shaped the role that you would like them to play. So now it's about working together. And it's also about following their lead, right? So oftentimes we like to think that we're the drivers of these situations, but sometimes in a people first model, it's really important to give some of that driver control over to the people that you're collaborating with. And that might mean that like in a driving scenario, they're the ones that's holding the roadmap and giving you some directions as to how it is, and you're at the steering wheel. But there has to be kind of a way that you're kind of taking some lead, taking their direction as part of the work. So how do you do that? So you gather them regularly to listen, right? You want to hear their insights. You want to constantly communicate roles and responsibilities and your expectations. That oftentimes helps to boost engagement over the long term, because sometimes, you know, people come in, they're very enthusiastic, but then over time that enthusiasm wanes, and then it's hard to keep them engaged. So communicating your expectations around that, reinforcing the roles and responsibilities they have, can be really helpful here. Also, you want to record, reference, share their comments. This is where you validate that you're actually listening to them. You don't necessarily always have to take the guidance that they're providing you, but it says a lot to people when they feel like they were really heard, that something that they said was captured in a formal way on the record. And it really validates their contribution. And so that's an easy way of doing that. And then really seek their guidance throughout the process. Like, don't just like, I think oftentimes we seek audiences in the message phase, right? We do message testing and things like that. And then once we pass the message phase, we kind of do our own thing and they're not involved in that. And I'm suggesting that try to find ways to keep them involved in the process. Have them give you guidance on the strategies and tactics. Have them give you guidance on what mid-course corrections might be necessary. Really think through other opportunities where they can be contributing as the campaign evolves and gets implemented. So now we get to the fourth phase, on the fourth step in this process, and this is evaluation. This is the part where you're on the dance floor, you're dancing with someone, and you want to keep the dance going. So the song changes or the tempo changes, and you have to pay attention to what's happening so that you can adjust your movements to match the beat or the tempo or whatever is happening on the dance floor. And so how we do that in social marketing is through evaluation, right? It is tracking and keeping track, setting metrics, setting benchmarks, and then as the campaign rolls out, to regularly be monitoring those to kind of see how things are going. So how audience counselors play a role in this, or can play a role in this, is that keep them a part of the process. Have them ask them for feedback, right? And be open to feedback. So sometimes that can always be very tricky. My mother always says, don't ask questions you don't want answers to. And that's very true here. that, you need to be open to the feedback. And then you want to verify the feedback though. So just because an individual or maybe one or two individuals are saying that there's a problem here or some adjustment needs to be made or something's not working, go back out to the larger audience and see if there's a way of validating or verifying those insights. And then once they get verified, then make adjustments, corrections based on those insights and suggestions. Let your audience counselors know that you're doing that. Again, you're validating their value, right? You're validating their contribution to the process. And everyone is much more engaged when they feel like what they're sharing is really being taken seriously. And because often for these communities, they share a lot and it's not, the history is they're not taken seriously. So in these interactions, it's really important to start breaking some cycles and really helping and reinforcing that you want their feedback and you want them to be a part of it. And then be very open about sharing the feedback you receive with the audiences you're engaging with, especially the audience counselors who've been involved in your work. Don't hide anything. Be transparent and authentic, because also you want to create trusted relationships. That's how trust is built, is when we are honest about how things are going. So share the positive, but also share the negative, share the challenges. And that also opens the door to kind of collaborate together to kind of figure out, how do we resolve that? How do we address that? And they may have, because they're closer to those communities you're trying to reach, they may have much better instinct or insights into how best to resolve those issues or what mid-course corrections might be more effective. They're not, social marketers. They're not going to be people with communications experience exactly, but they can instinctively know what stories, words, resources, information is going to be most effective to share with that audience to kind of get things back on a better track. All right. So we've talked through the steps of how to create authentic audience inclusion, right? How do we bring the people to our dance floor, our campaign dance floor, and how do we dance with them through a social marketing process? So now, how do you find them, right? That's always a big question. So you know what to do, and now where do you look for these audience counselors? All right. So the things you need to keep in mind when you're looking for individuals or groups to be the counselors in your work. They need to be people who can provide you this kind of assistance. How to, they know the community well enough, they can help you segment the audience. So break it down into factors or people on that continuum, stages of change that are going to be the most receptive to the information that you would like to share and the action you would like them to take. They also should be people that can build trusted connections between you and the audience that you're trying to reach. They also should be people that are invested in the community in a way that they can share insights about needs, motivation, benefits, and barriers. So those 4 question areas that I said was really important that we ask, particularly overburdened communities, in this process to kind of better have a sense of what it is that we need to create in our social marketing campaign that's going to be the most helpful and effective. They also need to be individuals or groups that add authenticity and credibility to your campaign messaging, materials, and activities. So just having them involved in the process should be elevating the work you do. What that means is that you should do a little bit of vetting research. You should make sure that you really understand who they are, and especially as government entities, whether agencies or programs, it becomes even more critical who you're seen as aligning to in communities. So do your research, whether that's asking people anecdotally information about the background of the people that you would like to work with, or using internet research and sleuthing, looking at their social media profiles, looking at their website, their blog, just looking to see if there's any red flags or potential conflicts that could come up later in the relationship. They also need to be people who can be with you for the long run so that they could also provide those mid-course correction and adjustment needs, right? So having that commitment and people who have the ability to have that commitment, which can be challenging, particularly when we're looking at the communities that we're talking about today, it can be hard to find people that can find commitment and be able to stick with something for several months or for a year or even longer than that. So thinking through what could make that easier for people. I'll use one example. We did a focus group a few years ago for an organization that wanted to talk to Latina mothers. And they had like they offered like a honorarium, a money honorarium. And when we were doing the recruiting, we just were not getting a response. And it was surprising. We didn't really understand why that was a problem. And so then we started to kind of do some additional research. We had a partner that was based in the community that we were working with. And they said, you know, you guys want to do it on a weeknight at dinner time. Like that, I think what would make it more appealing is if you offered food so that they could come and have a meal, and that you offered on-site childcare. And the minute we added those two elements to the mix, we got so much more interest and participants in the focus group because there were significant barriers to them for what we were trying to accomplish for this particular audience we were trying to engage. And so once we created solutions to those obstacles, right, it became so much easier to engage them. So really thinking through how you can alleviate some of the challenges that might prevent a long-term relationship can be really effective. And then you want people who can help give you counsel and guidance on how to set the benchmarks, right? They know these communities better than you do. They know them oftentimes intimately because either they've been working with them for a long time or they actually represent them and are a part of them. And they can also help you figure out how to define success. What does success look like here for what it is you're trying to achieve, what your communications goal is, right? What you want that behavior change action to be. And they can help translate that into something that is actually a SMART goal that's achievable for the community that you're trying to engage. And then the last thing is you want them to be a champion for you, and you want them to be able to amplify your campaign, whether that's the messaging, the activities, the actions, all of those things make for really great audience counselors. So where do you look for them? So I went ahead and I have several categories of types of community organizations to be looking for. And I think that starting with organizations is always good. Sometimes you can deviate from an organization and end up with, maybe individuals who are influencers in those communities. But at least starting with an organized group can be the most effective, especially if there's time constraints. So looking at community-based associations and foundations in the state, that's like Casa Latina, Equal Rights Washington, Washington Environmental Council. These are groups that are aligned to specific identity communities, whether that's shaped by race or ethnicity or other demographic factors that are based in those communities. So they already have relationships and they can be really great counselors or collaborators in the space. Local affiliates of national rights organizations. So looking at big organizations like NAACP or Unidos US, all of those people often have affiliates that are based on the more, local level. Partnering with them can be incredibly helpful. Also thinking about advocacy groups, related to the issues impacting overburdened communities. So there's quite a few in Washington State related to environmental justice, like Front and Center, Northwest Justice Project, or even cultural community centers that are based at say the county level. So looking at those organizations to see about opportunities to collaborate, to bring more of those audience members in, to kind of get more of their insights as to what to do next. Local support service groups, so like business owner associations, food banks and assistance centers, library branches. Librarians are some of the best resources, and local libraries are some of the best resources to get information out, also to bring the community in. And so looking at those as options are great. Look at school-based organizations, right? Like PTA chapters, teachers unions, booster clubs. Think of faith-based organizations. So looking at those leaders in service organizations in a variety of different places of worship, as well as often you'll see community centers related to faith-based organizations. That can also be a huge resource and great collaborator. Local businesses, places where people gather. Right now during COVID-19, this is particularly challenging, but we're starting to see the world open up a little bit. And as the year goes on, hopefully we're going to have more of these spaces open and welcoming for people to gather. So look at those in those communities you're trying to reach. Where are your community members going? And connecting with those local businesses and partnership opportunities. And then also looking at officials, right? But looking at officials outside of our, environmental space, like public health, the city government, education officials, looking at leaders, whether they're elected or appointed, can also be great advocates and could also provide a lot of ground level insights into, ways that you could shape the information that you're trying to create, or ways to create those dialogue channels between yourself and the larger audience. So I love Maya Angelou, and she is known for saying, do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. And what this means to me is that, people are often like, okay, so I know who I'm supposed to talk to. Like maybe it's like some faith-based community organization that is very embedded and trusted within this community you're trying to reach, but I don't know what to say to them. And I don't come from this community. It's not one of my identity communities. I don't know what to say. I'm afraid I'm going to say the wrong thing. And I think in those moments that, when we don't know, we need to share that we don't know. And I think that it is a sign of vulnerability and a sign of humility. And oftentimes those leaders or those individuals will be like, okay, I understand where you're coming from. Let me help you. Let me guide you. Let me counsel you on what makes sense next. And then so when we do get that information and we know that information, then we have the mission of doing better, right? And I think that's what this is all about. And that is really what a people first approach is, and how we can really strengthen our social marketing efforts by bringing our audience into the center of our work and including them in the decision making and in the insight gathering that we do as the work goes on. So thank you for the time. I think we're going to open it up for questions now, Heidi.
Yes, that was great. And I loved your statement also about being vulnerable, because that is one of the hardest things to do as adults. And especially we have these really calcified work environments where people are not ever given permission to say, I made a mistake or I don't know. So we have to be a lot kinder and gentler with one another. Thank you. So some questions are coming in. One is, people in overburdened communities may already be taxed by many asks to help in these kinds of community engagement efforts. Do you recommend offering compensation to partners and audience counselors or even participants with a budget for that?
So that is a great question and a great consideration. And I think that's a really true thing. And what I will say is that it's really important to ask the collaborator, what is it that they need? Because it might not be money. Like that example I gave earlier, right? We started with money in that focus group example. We were going to give an honorarium, but that was not what they needed, right? What they needed was free dinner, so they didn't have to worry about dinner that night for their kids. And then someone to watch their kids because they can't afford babysitters, right? Or they don't have people available to them to do that. So I think that's where you really have to open the door and say, okay, I know this is a big ask. What is it that we could do that could make your involvement easier for you? And it might be resources, but it could be something completely different that might actually be easier to do than finding the funding to do it.
Right. Interesting. Thank you. And do you recommend bringing audience counselors on as paid members of your actual team?
I think that sometimes can get a little tricky, right? But I think that especially if they're coming on, there's a very clear role, there's a very clear responsibilities, and there's very clear expectations as to, you know, where they're contributing in the campaign. Are there other things that are happening within your program that you want? So like really setting a very clear road for what their involvement it will be, I don't think it's problematic. And then being very transparent about it too. So like when that individual goes out into community on your behalf, that they know that they're an employee of that county or the state to do that work, right? So, and not maybe representing whatever other entity that they're connected to, right? So I think transparency is always the key there.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? There must be questions. I always think about how people kind of get really tripped up over these issues because there's like embarrassment, there's guilt, there's lack of experience. You know, you and I talked about like, you know, is there training like how not to be a jerk, you know, so and when you think about sort of cultivating an other orientation to the world, not just into get out of your head because we're sort of trapped by our own personal points of view. Do you have any insights on how to push people out and get them practiced in being other oriented, just as a general proposition, because it is the reaching out that can be so difficult?
Mm-hmm. So, you know, I have been recently because of, you know, last year and how that has kind of escalated conversations around particularly racial justice in this country. You know, there's been a lot of great training opportunities because people are just talking about DEI so much more. So I've been going to a lot of different types of training. And I have to say the most effective ones have been where we have been in dialogue with other attendees. Like there was like a small group. And so what that makes me say is like how you can really get prepared for this is to start talking about it. Start talking about it with your family, start talking about it with your friends. Because I think for the most part, we're very uncomfortable having these conversations, but we have to have uncomfortable conversations in order to get to where we want to go. And so go someplace where you normally feel comfortable and start challenging yourself to have those uncomfortable conversations. Sometimes we need to fuel them by things we're reading. So start reading books, start listening to podcast series to kind of start exploring things. You know, it's great that there are streaming services that have really committed in the last few months to add content like documentaries and different things to really kind of explore a lot of the issues that we're facing as a country in a very deep, profound way. Start expanding your mind by kind of creating more information coming in. Whether you agree with it or not, it's okay if you don't understand it or it doesn't make sense to you or it feels contrary to the way that you saw the world. That's okay. Have conversations about that. But start with the people around you, right? Start with where you feel the most comfortable. But when it starts to feel uncomfortable, don't stop. It's okay. Push through it. And I think if we go in with an openness and a willingness to listen, right? So not judge, but really listen. I think that it will help make the conversations you want to have as a professional with communities that are experiencing a lot of the things that we're talking about today. It will make it a little easier. But I think the key is to be open, is to have humility, and to be willing to do more listening than talking. Because I think it's the talking that just totally trips us up.
Yeah, for some of us. So here's a question. Do you have any advice on effective ways to conduct focus groups during COVID, given that computer access might be a barrier for some overburdened communities? Have you seen any creative strategies to get around this?
That is a great question. I know that a lot of people are using video conferencing tools as a way of doing that, right? And to kind of have like group conversations, but that sometimes can be a little bit difficult to moderate and manage, where people really feel comfortable. I think more people feel more comfortable with video conferencing now than they did, say, a year ago, and people have more access to those tools than they did before. I would say that if you're going to go that route, to really find out from your audience, what tools are they using? Like, are they using WhatsApp, the WhatsApp, right? Are they using Zoom? Are they using FaceTime? What are they using? And then use those platforms in order to kind of create those group discussions. But I think a lot of people are doing kind of one-on-one conversations. And I think that can be a really effective tool as well, because sometimes in a group setting, we don't always hear all the voices, right? Not all the voices feel comfortable to share.
Yeah.
So if it's possible to do one-on-one, do that as well. And that can be as easy as a phone call. It doesn't have to necessarily be a video, we're looking at each other conversation. It could just easily be a phone call, and then you ask the same questions in every interview you do. So there's a standard, just like you would have in a focus group.
Yeah, that's a really good point. This year I spent about 6 months on the phone on one-on-one conversations in an area of my work, and I found it remarkably gratifying, and it was a great way of building like a personal trust relationship with people, because you would talk about whatever you were talking about, but then you would ask them about like how their family is, or where they've been traveling, or what are they eating, or like in some cases everything in sight. So that was very good. All right, we've got 68 people on this call. I'm sure somebody has a question for Crystal about this really interesting area that has so much opportunity and promise. This is always, of course, the curse, right? In a multi-day conference, I used to call it where speakers go to die, like towards the end of a conference. Do you have a story that you want to tell, maybe about an example from one of your clients that might illustrate some of these principles?
Yeah, actually, I was thinking about this the other day. So I think I mentioned earlier that Vanguard does a lot of work in mental health. We've worked with Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration for more than 25 years. And one of those projects was on children's mental health. And one of the communities that was a focus of that work were tribal communities. And so we were, tasked with going to tribal communities to talk about how they could build public education campaigns in their community, focused on talking about children's mental health, that it happens, that there's services available, and that families can access those services and really help their children have healthier, happier lives, right? And so what we learned in that process is how to structure it. So it required, because tribal communities, as many of you are familiar in the state of Washington, are structured in a very specific way. They have a very defined culture, and that there's trust issues, particularly with government officials, right, and government programs. And so what we did was that we created partnerships and collaboration relationships with tribal elders and people who were from the community that work in mental health. And so when we went to those, to the reservations to do those presentations, we did not deliver them. That collaborator delivered it. So we would collaborate and build those presentations together and those workshops together. And then we would support that individual to be the person that stands in the room and delivers the information. And we would be a part of it too as an expert, right? So that if there are questions, we would help answer it. But we knew it was more important for that particular community, because of those trust issues, that they needed to see one of their own, right? Someone from within their community that understands their issues to be the person that shares those information. And it was incredibly effective. And a lot of the campaigns that resulted from those talks and those workshops are still in place today.
Yeah, that's always tough when somebody says like you're not the right carrier of the message, and so it's part of that process. Mary asked whether you have whether you've worked with ethnic media and sort of what that experience has been like. Mary's been sharing a lot of work locally about that.
Oh, great. Well, I should just say, like, media in general is a very different landscape in just the last few years than when I started my career, which I will not tell you when that was. But it's been a while. It's been a while. So I've seen a lot of evolutions. But I think there has been a lot of changes, particularly around ethnic media, that have been impacted by some of the bigger changes, which is newsrooms are shrinking, right? And there's less print options and more online content that people are looking for. And so I think what's really important is doing your research and really start, before you even start a conversation with a reporter, that you spend some time on their outlet website and social media channels, that you have a really good understanding of what kind of story they want to tell, what they're interested in talking about. And just because, like, say, for example, they are a Black media outlet, that they are concerned about all issues impacting the Black community. They may not be. They may have a very specific focus or a very specific perspective, and those are the kind of stories that they're looking for. So there might not be synchronicity there, right? But it's really important to do your research so you can have those kind of like respectful conversations and also align what you want to talk about to what it is that they want to talk about. And I think that builds the best kind of relationships and has the increased likelihood of getting a story placed.
Thank you. Okay, up here. I'd love to hear examples of different types of roles and leadership committees you've seen developed for different campaigns.
Okay,
So
great.
roles and leadership committees. That's a
Yeah,
good one.
that is a good one. So I've done a lot of work in this space, particularly with government clients. So I'm going to be using that as a bit of a reflection point. So oftentimes in that world, it's committees and councils, right? So advisory committees, advisory councils. One of the things that I think that has made those committees that I've been involved with supporting, whether that's like from the beginning or once the committee is ongoing, is really having it led by someone within that committee. So instead of it being led by you, right, as the organizer, really asking someone that you've invited to be a part of the committee to be the chair, right? And that doesn't mean that they have the whole burden of running the committee. You support them to run it, but they're the ones that send out the communication to people. They're the ones that lead people through the agenda. And it feels much more cohesive and inclusive when you do it that way, as opposed to you as the program person leading it yourself, right? And also it gives you a better insight of how to use that time, because that conversation with that chair is going to give you, when you're building the agenda, right? They're going to give you insights into like, that's not what we should really talk about here. I think it might be more valuable if we talk about this. Or I don't think that's the things that you're outlining is worthy of a meeting. Maybe we could do it in a different way so that we can be more respectful of everyone's time. Or this group really can't speak to that, what you're looking for. Like, I think we have to go to another resource. So they can give you a lot of insights about that, but having that kind of, that's a really great rule to create, which is relatively easy in most scenarios to create. Sometimes making like that ambassador person, so like once, especially once a campaign starts rolling, you know, having them kind of be a spokesperson, being one of the spokespeople that you can offer for media interviews or at events to give remarks, right? So showing that not only did we talk to your community before we created this campaign, but we're involving your community into this campaign at a very visible, high level. And it says a lot about the intention and commitment that you have towards what it is you're trying to accomplish and how you value the community you're trying to reach.
That's great. You're so nice and clear and direct. Maybe you should teach some science communication.
Sometimes I do. Sometimes I do, Heidi. I sometimes wear that hat too.
Well, we are, I think, close. Dre, are we sort of down to the wire here?
We've
Dre.
got about 5 minutes left.
Oh, we've got 5 minutes left. Goodness. Okay. So does anyone else who's on this call have questions? Because otherwise we're going to start, I don't know, maybe we'll dance.
Well, I can have a closing thought too, Heidi.
Yeah,
If that's
please.
helpful while we're waiting for another question.
Of course.
So I just want to say that this is really hard. I think that when we're doing this kind of inclusion work, when we're trying to reach communities that we know have experienced a lot, right? And to an earlier question, have a lot of pressures on them. Some of them that is completely out of their control, right? It's just the environment in which we're in. It makes it really hard to do this work, and sometimes it makes it really frustrating to do this work. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that to ourselves and acknowledge that to our colleagues and acknowledge it to the communities we're trying to serve. Because I feel like that's the part that is really going to help us break through in these places. Is, I've talked a lot about vulnerability and humility, but I think it's a really important aspect of this. There's an emotional intelligence component to diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And that is a part of it. As much as we try to be removed as professionals, and try to make it not personal, it is personal. These are personal issues because this is how we see ourselves. These are how our communities see themselves. And particularly in the space that you guys are communicating and advocating for, this is difficult for people to acknowledge that these situations are happening around them in their environment and could be impacting their health and impacting their homes and impacting their communities and impacting their children. And so it's personal. So at a certain extent, we have to also make it a little bit personal and be able to kind of show that those chinks in the armor, right? In order to kind of build to some place that has trust, that builds with some place that has connection, and hopefully builds to some place where people are willing to do something more, something that's harder for them to do in order for us to get a better outcome, right? And that's like a cleaner environment and a healthier spaces for us to live and work in. And so, but it takes a little elbow grease and some emotional elbow grease in order to get there. And, I love the musical Hamilton. And, Aaron Burr tells Alexander Hamilton, talk less, smile more, right? Well, I have a version of that where I say in these kind of conversations like what we're having today, talk less, listen more. Talk less, listen more, because that will always serve you well. You will always gain a valuable insight, a new direction, a solution you had not anticipated by just listening instead of telling people what they should do, direct, and just shoving information at them. We need to shove the right information at them, and less shoving, more listening.
Yeah, you raise a very important issue, because also in our field, there's a lot of like deep technical expertise in engineering and the sciences. And we are accustomed to talking at people to share what we are finding out, but we are less practiced in saying, what is your lived experience? And, what do you think? What are you feeling? Like, what is your life like? Here's a question. How do you engage?
I was just going to say, Neil deGrasse Tyson is a really good example of how to take scientific information and make it relevant to the people he's communicating with. He's very, very good at it. So if you're looking for ways of like how to do that, learn that skill, he's a really good example to check out, because he takes very complicated information. And Bill Nye the Science Guy, also a good example of that. And he's doing it for kids. But sometimes we need to talk at that level in order for people to understand these kind of science information and concepts that we want to express.
Yeah.
Those are two very good examples of how to do that well.
Yeah, that's very good. Thank you. I appreciate that. So
Yeah,
how do you engage people who have elected to be silent on social justice issues?
So I think where you start is you ask why, right? Clearly there's an obstacle, right? Especially if it's an issue that impacts them, impacts the world that they live in, impacts the people that they care about. There must be something significant that is an obstacle preventing them from engaging, right? And it may not be an obstacle you can remove. It may not be an obstacle that can be addressed. But I think asking why, but why without judgment, right? So why being like, I feel like you have a lot to say about this. Tell me why you don't want to say it. And start the conversation there will kind of help you figure out whether that's an obstacle that can be challenged and addressed, or something where you have to accept that and move a different direction.
Yeah, and
there's always an answer to that why question that is significant.
Yeah, and it kind of raises the issue of people's ability to be direct but still gentle, because people sometimes confuse asking direct questions or having direct statements with being kind of rough, particularly here in the Pacific Northwest. It's a conversational style that's different than the East Coast, I think, where people are less comfortable around having those kind of sort of direct communications. So that's also a cultural competency issue that we grapple with.
Well, I think starting before you ask the question to that point, Heidi, is that, acknowledge that this is difficult. Like I imagine that this is a really difficult and uncomfortable topic to talk about, but I would really appreciate and value any insights you could give me as to why it's difficult for you to talk about these things, so that I can better create safer spaces for other people to be able to feel more comfortable and secure to share, right? So it's acknowledging, like, I understand, or I'm imagining that this is really difficult for you.
That was good. We have you taped now. We're going to start.
Yeah, the part you can't say I know. That's the dangerous statement. You can't say I know this is difficult for you, because you don't. You don't walk in that person's shoes. You don't live their life. You don't live in their neighborhood. You don't know that. But you can imagine it, or you could understand it to be, but let them validate that. Let them be the ones that tells you instead of you telling them.
Right. Yeah, that's very good. Goodness. Okay. Well, I think that we are done with the questions. We only have like a minute left, and I want to thank you so much. It's been a really interesting conversation, and it was delightful to have you. And I'm glad that spring has sprung in beautiful DC, and people are saying thank you, and we're very grateful for you, and we look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you. And I'm very grateful for you. Thank you for doing the work that you're doing. And I hope that what we talked about today kind of helps elevate and strengthen the great work that you're already undertaking. So thank you.
No, thanks. Well, we'll see you soon, Crystal. Take care.
All right. Thanks,
Good
everybody.
to see you. Bye-bye. Bye, everyone. Thank you for joining us.